I want to tell you about a Saturday morning on November 1st, 1755, All Saints' Day. A morning when the churches of Portugal's great imperial capital were full of people, full of candles, full of the accumulated wealth and memory of one of the most powerful maritime empires in the world. And then, at approximately 9:40 in the morning, everything ended. Not metaphorically, not gradually. Everything ended in roughly 6 minutes of seismic violence that would be described in the years that followed as one of the worst natural disasters in recorded European history. The official story is familiar. An earthquake magnitude estimated between 8.5 and 9.0 on the Richter scale. A subsequent tsunami that rolled into the harbor in 3 waves. Fires that burned for days. 30,000 dead, perhaps 60,000. Some estimates go higher. The lower city, the Baixa, the administrative heart of Lisbon, essentially ceased to exist. The sealed archives, coincidentally, destroyed, and I believed that story. For a long time, I believed it completely. But the more I looked, I realized I had been looking at only part of the picture. Because here's what I couldn't shake. The world didn't just move on. It moved differently almost everywhere, almost simultaneously. And the deeper I went into the decades that followed 1755, the more I found a pattern. Not of recovery, but of replacement. Not of rebuilding, but of rewriting. A moment so historically convenient, so cosmically well-timed, and perhaps so useful for burying whatever the archives had recorded about what came before. Because some researchers believe the Mudflood, a catastrophic sediment event that appears to have swallowed entire building complexes across the entire world, may have begun here. With Lisbon. The first tremor of something far larger than one city's tragedy. That the coincidence alone demands we stop and look more carefully. Because the deeper I went, the less comfortable I became with the word coincidence. I came to this the way most people do, sideways. It wasn't a manifesto that pulled me in. It wasn't a late-night rabbit hole. It was a photograph. A single photograph of a building, actually several buildings, in what appeared to be a Central Asian city, with architectural details so ornate, so structurally sophisticated, that I found myself asking a question that I couldn't answer easily. Who built this? And when the official answer came back, clean and fast. Colonial-era construction, 18th or 19th century, various European influences. Fine, except that the building in question predated the supposed colonial presence by what appeared to be decades. And the European influence looked, when you really examined it, less like a European export and more like a shared source. Like both European and Central Asian examples were drawing from the same well. That was the first anomaly. The second came when I started looking at maps, old maps. Specifically, maps from the 16th and 17th centuries. The kind you find in digitized European library collections. The kind historians use to trace the contours of what was known and unknown. And on many of those maps, particularly those from the 1600s and early 1700s, there it was. A vast territory, sometimes labeled Tartaria, sometimes Tartary, sometimes Mughal Tartary or Grand Tartary or Chinese Tartary. But always there, always enormous, covering in some representations a territory larger than Russia, larger than China, stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific. And then, and this is where the pattern repeats with unsettling precision, by the 1770s and 1780s, the label begins to dissolve, not all at once, gradually, cartographically, like a watercolor left in rain. By the early 19th century, it's essentially gone. I kept asking, why does a territory that appeared on maps for over 200 years simply stop appearing? Countries don't vanish. Geographical realities don't evaporate. Unless, of course, someone decides they should. That's where the Lisbon earthquake re-entered my investigation. Let me describe what actually happened on November 1st, 1755, because the official account, as accounts often do, underplays certain details that I find impossible to ignore. The earthquake struck in the morning, early. Estimates of its magnitude range from 8.5 to 9.0 on what we now call the Richter scale. It was felt across Europe in parts of North Africa. There are accounts of strange water behavior as far away as Scandinavia. The shaking in Lisbon lasted, depending on which survivor account you read, between 3 and 6 minutes. Then came the fires, burning for 5 days, fed by the toppled candles of All Saints' Day masses, spreading through the tightly packed structures of a city that had been, until that morning, one of the wealthiest and most powerful in the Western world. Then came the tsunami. Waves estimated at heights of 20 to 30 feet struck the harbor, the waterfront, the Baixa district. The areas where merchants, administrators, and record keepers operated were consumed. What was lost? The question seems simple. The answer is anything but. The Royal Library of Lisbon, gone. Tens of thousands of volumes. The Torre do Tombo archives, one of the oldest and most comprehensive record repositories in the known world, heavily damaged. Municipal records. Trade records. The records of Portugal's extensive colonial and maritime operations. Operations that had for the past 2 centuries brought Portuguese ships into contact with territories and civilizations across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Those records, those contact records. The official explanation says it was a tragedy, a natural disaster, and maybe it was. Fire after earthquake is not unusual. Archive destruction and urban catastrophe is documented elsewhere. I accept that. But the official explanation begins to collapse when you look at what replaced those archives in the decades that followed. Because something remarkable happened after 1755. A man named Sebastião de Melo, better known as the Marquis of Pombal, took effective control of the Portuguese state and oversaw what has been called one of history's most systematic urban reconstruction projects. The Pombaline downtown of Lisbon, built in the ruins, is genuinely extraordinary. Perfectly gridded, earthquake-resistant by early engineering design, built with a speed and uniformity that contemporary observers noted was almost uncanny. Where did the funding come from? How were the architectural standards so quickly universalized? How was the social organization of reconstruction managed at such scale, so rapidly, by a government that had just lost its administrative center? These are not accusations. These are questions. And when you ask them, you notice something else. Pombal didn't just rebuild Lisbon. He simultaneously reorganized Portugal's relationship with information. He expelled the Jesuits, the primary educators and record keepers across Portugal's world-spanning empire, in 1759. He reformed the universities. He restructured what was taught, how it was taught, and most importantly, what was preserved. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Disaster, information loss, systematic reconstruction, new educational frameworks. A generation later, the historical record looks different. The Lisbon earthquake was not the only catastrophic event of this period. Not close. In the same general time frame, the middle decades of the 18th century, there is a cascade of events across the world that individually each has a satisfying official explanation. Together, they begin to look like something else. There are accounts, and I want to be careful here because these come from a variety of sources with varying levels of documentation, of widespread geological and climatic anomalies throughout the mid to late 1700s. Unusual flooding events in river systems that should not have flooded the way they apparently did. Sediment deposits in European and Asian cities that in certain cases appear to predate the official dating of construction by decades. Buildings found partially submerged, ground floors that function as basements, windows that begin below what is now street level. This is what the researchers who study this period sometimes call the Mudflood hypothesis. Now, I'm not going to tell you there was a mudflood. I'm not in a position to make that claim. What I will tell you is that the architectural evidence, and there is architectural evidence, photographs, surveys, building records, raises a simple but critical question. Why do so many buildings across so many continents have their lowest levels buried, not renovated, not extended downward, buried, with the architectural details of those lower levels still intact, still ornate, still in many cases more sophisticated than the levels above. Who buries their own windows? Who buries their own doorways? And if a large-scale geological event, seismic, hydrological, or otherwise, did deposit significant sediment across certain regions in the mid to late 18th century, then the Lisbon earthquake, with its attendant tsunamis and liquefaction events, begins to look less like a standalone disaster and more like a trigger. A beginning. The first domino in a cascade that remade the physical landscape of the world, and with it the documentary record that might have told us what that landscape had looked like before. The evidence suggests something much larger was at work. Let's go back to the cartography, because this is where the official explanation collapses most cleanly. Tartaria, or Tartary, take your pick, appears consistently on European maps from roughly the 1500s through the 1700s. We're not talking about a peripheral legend, a mythological notation in the margin. We're talking about a named, labeled, geographically defined territory that cartographers across France, England, Holland, Germany, and Spain all agreed existed and agreed on the rough boundaries of. The 1706 map by Nicolas de Fer shows it. The 1710 Herman Moll map shows it. The 1744 d'Anville map, one of the most sophisticated cartographic documents of its era, shows it divided into sub-regions with named cities, trade routes, rivers. Named cities. Trade routes. This is not mythological. This is cartographic infrastructure. This is a territory that someone knew well enough to draw in detail. And then, through the 1760s, 1770s, and 1780s, the very decades following the Lisbon catastrophe, the label begins its slow dissolution. The subregions lose their names. The cities become unlabeled. The vast interior becomes cartographically a kind of blank. Not virgin territory. The terrain features are still there. But a territory without a name, without a political identity, without, it seems, a civilization. By the time Napoleon is marching east in the early 19th century, the maps he is using look, in that region, almost nothing like the maps of a century prior. This raises a simple but critical question. What happened between 1750 and 1800 that unmade a civilization so thoroughly that its name disappeared from every map in every European capital, apparently simultaneously, apparently without debate, apparently without anyone writing a major historical account of how this enormous named territory ceased to exist? Because I have looked. And the silence was deafening. There is no fall of Tartaria in the history books the way there is a fall of Rome or a fall of Constantinople. There is no treaty, no final battle, no succession crisis documented with the kind of detail that historians typically apply to the end of a major political entity. There is just absence, a slow, quiet cartographic deletion. Coinciding with the greatest archival destruction event in the Western world's recent history. Here is where it gets, if anything, stranger. The decades following the Lisbon earthquake and the cartographic erasure of Tartaria are characterized, across multiple continents, by something that researchers in this space have started calling the inheritance period. It works like this. New administrative structures, new governments, new colonial systems, new municipal authorities appear in regions and cities where, by all official accounts, there was previously wilderness or primitive settlement. They appear in these cities and they move into buildings, extraordinary buildings, buildings of a scale and sophistication that, according to the official timeline, should have taken decades and enormous resources to construct. And yet, there are no construction records, no labor contracts, no documented quarrying operations, no accounts of the years of work that should have preceded occupancy. In city after city, on continent after continent, the same architectural vocabulary, the same domed rooflines, the same ornate facades, the same proportional systems appears, in St. Petersburg and San Francisco, in Melbourne and Chicago, in Bombay and Buenos Aires. buildings that were supposedly constructed independently in different decades by different architects in different cultural contexts, sharing details so specific, so technically demanding, that the phrase architectural coincidence begins to feel like an insult to the intelligence. The deeper I went, the more the inheritance period looked less like a period of construction and more like a period of occupation, of moving in, of taking what was already there and writing new names above the doors, not building from scratch, not importing a style, but inheriting, and then, critically, obscuring the inheritance. And that's where the historical rewriting becomes impossible to ignore. Because if you inherit a civilization, if you occupy its cities, repurpose its buildings, redirect its trade networks, you have a problem. You have a paper trail. You have locals who remember. You have travelers who wrote accounts. You have potentially records in distant archives that contradict your new narrative. So what do? You write a new history. A better history. A history with clean origins, with documented construction dates, with named architects and named patrons and named sources of funding. You populate the past with a confidence that the actual past, with all its chaos and incompleteness, rarely possesses. And you wait. You wait for the generation that remembered to die. You wait for the travelers' accounts to lose credibility. You wait for the children to grow up learning the new version, and for those children to teach their own children. Until the distance between the original event and the present moment is so vast, so filled with authoritative restatements of the official narrative, that the original question, who built this and when and for whom, sounds not like a reasonable historical inquiry, but like conspiracy theory. I've noticed something about that phrase, conspiracy theory. It tends to appear most reliably at exactly the points where the official account is most vulnerable, where the documentation is thinnest, where the questions are most dangerous. Make of that what you will. The narrative shift that followed the Lisbon earthquake and the Tartarian erasure was not subtle once you know what to look for. The Enlightenment, that brilliant, humane, world-remaking intellectual project, emerged conveniently in the same decades. New frameworks for understanding history, new institutions of learning, new standards of documentary evidence that, interestingly, tended to discount exactly the kinds of oral traditions, indigenous accounts, and pre-existing records that might have told a different story. I'm not saying the Enlightenment was a cover story. I'm asking, could it have served, among its genuine achievements, as a mechanism for establishing new epistemic authority, for deciding institutionally what counted as knowledge and what didn't? Because once you control what counts as evidence, you control what happened. Let me be precise about what was in those Lisbon archives. Portugal, by 1755, had been operating as a world-spanning maritime power for nearly 3 centuries. Portuguese ships had reached the coast of West Africa in the 1400s. Vasco da Gama had rounded the Cape in 1498. Portuguese traders were operating in India, in Japan, in Brazil, in the Spice Islands of Southeast Asia. They were, in the most literal sense, on a worldwide level, the most connected European power of the early modern era. Their records reflected that connectivity. Reports from the interior of Asia, accounts of cities and civilizations encountered far from the coasts, trade agreements with polities that don't appear in the standard Western historical narrative, knowledge of territories, inland territories, that a maritime power would have had unique access to through its network of overland trading partners. Knowledge of potentially what lay in the vast interior. The vast, named, cartographically documented interior. All of it gone. Not reduced, not damaged, gone. And here's the thing about archival destruction that rarely gets discussed. It's not just what you lose in the fire. It's what you lose in the assumption that there's nothing left to find. When a library burns, the absence of documentation becomes paradoxically evidence that there was nothing to document. The circle closes. The silence becomes its own argument. The official explanation for why we know so little about the pre-Columbian Americas, about the pre-colonial African interior, about the civilizations of Central Asia before the Russian expansion. The official explanation is always, at bottom, that there wasn't much to know, that these were sparse, primitive, unrecorded peoples. But what if the recording happened, and the records burned? What if the Lisbon earthquake was, in the most brutal and efficient sense possible, a filing system reset? I keep coming back to this, because it's the part that the official account cannot address. If Tartaria, or whatever we choose to call the civilization or civilizations that occupied that vast labeled territory, was gradually erased from European consciousness between roughly 1750 and 1820, that erasure required coordination. Cartographers in Paris, London, Amsterdam, Berlin, Madrid, all updating their maps in the same direction, in the same decades, without, as far as I can find, any documented diplomatic or scientific consensus that drove the change. Why would a French cartographer and an English cartographer and a Dutch cartographer all independently decide, within a generation of each other, to stop labeling the same enormous territory? What were they responding to? The pattern repeats with unsettling precision in the architectural sphere as well. The same decisions made across multiple continents in multiple decades by people who supposedly didn't know each other, about which buildings to repurpose, which to demolish, which to assign new construction dates, which to simply fill with new bureaucratic life and never discuss the origins of again. Not independent invention, not parallel development, not coincidental convergence, but something that looks, when you stand far enough back to see the whole pattern, like a coordinated response to a shared event. A reset. A systematic reorientation of the cartographic, architectural, and documentary record around a new narrative framework. And the Lisbon earthquake, I keep thinking, may have been the moment that made the reset possible. Not because it was the only disaster of that era, not because it destroyed everything, but because it destroyed enough. Enough that the gaps could be filled with new stories. Enough that the questions couldn't be fully answered anymore. Enough that the absence of evidence could be reframed, quietly, as evidence of absence. When I look at photographs of certain buildings in Samarkand, in Kazan, in the older districts of cities across the former Tartarian geographic sphere, I see the same thing I see in photographs of buildings in Philadelphia, in Edinburgh, in the neoclassical districts of cities that were supposedly built from nothing in the early 19th century by new, ambitious, documented civilizations. I see a vocabulary, a shared visual grammar, specific proportional relationships between columns and entablatures, specific decorative programs around windows and doorways, a specific relationship between the human scale and the architectural mass that says, to anyone trained to read it, this was designed by someone who understood something about how human beings inhabit space, something that takes generations to learn, something that requires not just skilled craftsmen, but a tradition of skilled craftsmen, a school, an inheritance of technical knowledge passed from master to apprentice across decades or centuries. And I look at the official construction dates, the mid-19th century dates, the completed in 1847 and dedicated in 1863 plaques. And I think, in 30 years, in 50 years, from wilderness to this, the math doesn't work. Not without a significant and significantly unacknowledged head start. So where does that leave us? I started with a date, November 1st, 1755. All Saints' Day, the ground moving under a city full of people who had gathered, as human beings do, in the places that mattered most to them. The archives, the cathedrals, the repositories of memory. I end with a question. Many questions, actually, but one that I keep returning to in the quiet hours. If there was a civilization, call it what you like, the maps called it Tartaria, vast enough to appear on every major European map for 2 centuries, sophisticated enough to leave architectural traces on multiple continents, interconnected enough to have left records in the archives of the world's great maritime power. If that civilization existed, and if the earthquake of 1755 helped initiate or accelerate, or simply provide cover for, a process of archival destruction and cartographic erasure that unfolded over the following half-century. And if the inheritance period that followed involved new powers moving into old spaces and writing new names above old doors, then what we call history may not be what we think it is. Not a continuous record, not an accumulation of documented fact, but a selection, a curated silence, a set of answers to questions that someone, somewhere, decided were the right questions to ask. And the questions that remain, the questions that the silence cannot answer, that the burned archives cannot resolve, that the erased maps cannot explain. Those questions don't go away just because they're inconvenient. They sit in the sediment. They wait in the buried window frames. They persist in the architectural grammar of buildings that nobody officially can fully explain. The deeper I go, the more certain I become of only one thing. We haven't found the bottom yet.